y'all. Welcome to Parent Empowerment with Mandy Drogin. I'm Mandy. I'm just a mom sitting down with real Texas parents talking about what's going on in our schools. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, property tax expert, economics expert, and father, James Quintero. James, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Mandy. Thanks for having me.
So you recently just released a report talking about debt and the explosion of debt across our great state. Talk to us about the headline. I'm looking at it right now. How much debt
Too much.
Are we in? Well, it's always too much. It's always too much.
That's right. So I've been here a long time, and one of the things that I've come to do as part of my traditional duties around here is I send the Bond Review Board a nice little email every November-ish asking them to please let me know what is the latest data that they have on government debt. Okay. And Justin Grohl, fantastic person over there. Justin, if you're watching, thanks for all your help. What Justin revealed to me just a month or two ago is that local government debt owed by all entities, both principal and interest, has now reached $500 billion. Let me repeat that. Local governments have accumulated $500 billion of total debt.
$500 billion.
$500 billion.
The great state of Texas, our local governments have driven us into $500 billion in debt.
$500 billion. And what concerns me, not only as a taxpayer, but as the father of 5 Texans, we are loading up this amount of debt in a very rapid fashion. So if you compare this number, this $500 billion of total debt with the year prior, it's about a $40 billion increase. So in 1 year, we have amassed another $40 billion in government debt. And so it's very alarming to me how much the bad guys are putting on the taxpayer credit card. And
for our kids. You said you have 5, I have 3. We are enslaving our children.
That's right.
We're enslaving our current property taxpayers, but we are really, really actively destroying our children's future by going into this much debt. And for what?
That's a great question. I hope to get into what exactly we're using this debt for, because, and I have to be careful when I talk about this issue, and I want your audience to know the Texas Public Policy Foundation does not necessarily believe that all debt is bad. Right. There are certain multi-generational projects, infrastructure that we need, and it makes sense to go into debt for.
Right.
But when you look at the things that local governments are putting us on the hook for, oftentimes it's not those necessary items. Right. It's a wish list set of things that we're going into debt for, and that really don't make sense.
So let's talk about that. Yeah. So an example of good debt, you said, would be infrastructure that supports driving to work, that supports building or bringing and encouraging business to come into Texas, to provide jobs and a tax base and things like that. But you said that's not what the majority of this is.
Yeah, and a great example that I like to holler about on social media quite often is these magnificent Taj Mahal high school football stadiums that seem to be popping up left and right all throughout the state, and that range anywhere between $50 to $60 to $70 and even $80 million for a single high school football stadium. That's the sort of stuff that really catches my eye and really concerns me.
Yeah.
Because, of course, it's not just that we build this magnificent thing and now we're on the hook for $80 million plus interest, but there's all sorts of maintenance-related costs. There are staffing costs. There's just this. For me, I guess what really concerns me is there's a mindset that comes along with it that, since we have this $80 million Taj Mahal facility, we need to complement that with other magnificent buildings and structures and, administrative facilities.
But it's for the kids.
It's for the kids, right? And so, oftentimes these things don't exist in a vacuum. It's the evidence of a really, I would say, spendthrift mindset. that exist at the local level and really ought to alarm everyone, especially as we're all kind of going through the property tax process anew. Here we are in January. We're all,
everyone got their bills back.
That's right.
Everyone's paid and we're in a new cycle, right?
So we just paid. We're going through the valuation process right now, and hopefully everybody's getting ready to protest whatever value they're assigned and get that lodged in the system by probably April or May.
I spend some time looking on social media. I'm in some mom groups. I want to know what parents are saying, what they're talking about. And I have seen back when property tax bills came out, people were quite shocked after the legislature had passed $18 billion in property tax relief back in 2023. And I think that people were really expecting a greater cut, definitely not an increase that several got, to their property taxes. Can you walk us back a little bit? Let's go back before we go forward.
Sure.
The legislature passed $17 billion of property tax relief in 2023. It's the largest property tax relief package ever, correct?
18 billion.
18 billion,
yes.
Excuse me. 18 billion, thank you. Huge. 5 months later, in November of that year, correct me if I'm wrong, just ISDs alone, not the other aspects of local government, just ISDs alone went out for about $34-ish billion in new debt, and they passed about $28 billion, correct?
Yeah, there was a really alarming rise in the amount of debt that school districts sought last year immediately after the passage of that large tax cut bill. And, I'm one of those weird guys that likes to go and investigate these things to assess trends. And so, one of the things that we spent a large part of last year doing is digging through a lot of documents known as voter information documents. And these have lots of really good detail, although I think the methodology could be improved on the tax impact side of things. But But what these show and what governments are required to prove out to the public is, hey, we're asking for, let's say this amount of principal, but it's also we think it's going to cost this much in interest, and so here's the total amount. So we went and collected all of that information for the several hundred bond propositions pitched in the November 2023 cycle as well as the May 2024 cycle.
Okay.
And what we found is that school districts pitched $33.7 billion in new debt for that November 2023 cycle.
So 5 months later.
5 months later, as we were all voting to approve and ratify the constitutional amendment to increase the homestead exemption, at the very same time we were doing that, a lot of voters were also being asked to approve new debt, which of course puts upward pressure on your tax. So of that $33.7 billion in new debt, voters ended up passing $28 billion.
Okay.
In the very next cycle, in May 2024, we had school districts seeking $19.1 billion of new debt, of which $14.1 billion was approved. And again, those numbers are principal and interest, so by the time everyone gets done paying it off, we will have effectively over the last two election cycles, excluding November 2024, in November 2023 and May 2024, voters approved more than $40 billion of new school district debt. That doesn't even count cities and counties and special districts, all of whom bring their own special obligations to bear. So we have $40 billion in new school district debt that that is going to cause a lot of tax increases in the near future that offset what the legislature has done on the tax relief side. And it's very concerning because, we have one governmental institution that is very clearly trying to move us in a particular direction, and you have lots of little local governmental entities that are moving us in the complete opposite direction. And again, a lot of these expenditures are very questionable.
Yes. So let's talk about kind of how and why this is happening. But also, let me ask you real quick. So just to confirm, the $18 billion in property tax relief, at what point do you think the savings that people could have realized, when will that be gone? It's got to be soon, right? I mean, that's massive.
Great question. So when the legislature sine die for the final time in 23, what what was estimated is that the average taxpayer should have realized about a $1,300 tax cut by the time that homestead exemption was ratified and put in place.
Okay.
Okay, so the average person should have seen a $1,300 decrease in year 1 and year 2.
Okay.
What immediately happened, not only with respect to bonds, but also voter approval tax rate elections, just the normal rate increases, certificates of obligation were issued, right? There were lots of things that went into effect almost immediately thereafter that began to erode the level of relief that most people expected. And so we have some information online at texaspolicy.com that tracks some of the average person's experience in some of your larger metro areas. And what we found is generally about a third to half of that relief was eroded in year 1 for a lot of people. And then by year 2, it was gone, right? And if you're here, a resident of the Austin area, you know that, Austin ISD not only ate up the relief, but then added to it, right? We just had Austin ISD alone increase the average person's taxes by $700 this year.
Yeah.
Right. So that one action alone between their rate increase and the voter approval tax rate election eroded more than half of the expected tax relief that the legislature worked so hard on last year. And so we find ourselves almost back to square one, where we're now approaching the 2025 legislature asking for relief, but we also want reform.
That's it.
Right.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not wrong because I have the contracts. I'm not even going to play that game. I already have the contracts. I can see them. Let's go back to the last time we talked, we were talking about electioneering. I know for a fact, and I want the legislature to hear this, to see it and to understand it. I know they are working hard right now, today, talking about property tax relief. How do we deliver property tax relief that is much needed to Texans? And I have contracts showing that it doesn't matter how much property tax relief that they give, it will all be up for election at the ISD level. The bonds are already in action. The planning committees are already in action to erode whatever relief is given. Is that correct?
Yeah. In fact, I think you have a lot of people operating off of their 2023 experience where the legislature acted, and that triggered a lot of opportunistic local governments to move forward with tax grabs of all sorts. And they're probably thinking the same thing's going to happen this session, right? We're going to have some measure of tax relief, maybe not as big as the prior legislative session, but there's going to be something, and that will enable them to spend that relief and grab those savings in different ways, which means the legislature needs to pair tax relief with tax reform. Otherwise, we're going to end up back in the same place in 2027, scratching our heads, wondering what happened.
And they're just going to keep racking up this to $500 billion. That is insane. How much of that is ISD debt, James?
Terrific question. So when you look at this $500 billion of local government debt, 40% is on the count of school districts, right? So school districts bear the most responsibility for the position we're in when it comes to our debt picture. By the way, if you divide that $202 billion figure, which again is principal and interest, you divide that by the number of students enrolled in school right now, you come up with about $36,000 owed across the state for every student currently enrolled in K through 12. Right?
$36,000 in debt attached to every student enrolled in the K through 12 system.
That's right. So I got 4 kids currently enrolled in our K through 12 institutions. That is something on the order of $100,000 plus just owed by the Quintero family for our school district debt. Again, that doesn't count your city, county, or special district debt, which adds another $300 billion to massive total. But these are figures that are absolutely astronomical, and one of the most frustrating elements of all of this is one of the things I did is I've been tracking this long enough to where I have some pretty good data sets. And I just went back 5 years. I wanted to say, look, how much did school district debt grow over the last 5 years? What have we been doing? Well, it turns out that schools added about $56 billion in total debt. And that represents a growth from FY 2021 to FY 2025 of 38%, right? So I said, okay, well, that kind of exists on its own. I wonder how that compares to enrollment growth, right? How does our 38% growth in ISD debt compare to how the number of students that are coming into our buildings? Well, it turns out that school enrollment from 2020 to 2024 only grew by 0.7%. Not even 1%.
Not even 1%. So the population in our K through 12 public school system did not grow by 1%. It was less than 1% of growth, and yet we grew our bond debt by 38%.
That's right.
All right.
So there is clearly, the evidence is showing that there's clearly something at play here, right? It's not just that, well, schools feel like, we have all sorts of growth needs, and so we need to add this new debt. There's another factor or another set of factors at play. And before we get to that, one thing I want to remind your audience is as part of the legislature's $18 billion tax relief package, there was a healthy dose of compression, right? Okay. And for those who don't know what compression is, it just means the legislature told your school districts, lower your rates.
Okay.
Lower those M&O rates, which pay for your day-to-day expenses, and we'll make you whole with state surplus, right? Okay. We're to a place now where the maximum compressed rate is set at 68 cents per $100 of value.
Okay.
That is almost on par with the maximum INS rate of 50 cents per $100 of value. And for those of you who don't know what an INS rate is, that's just the rate that school districts are allowed to impose to pay off your debt. Okay. What I'm saying is that your operational tax rate is almost at the same level as your INS tax rate. So when we talk about debt, the problem is almost at the same level as the amount of school district spending as represented by the M&O tax. So your M&O and your INS rate are almost at the same level. So we shouldn't look at this debt problem and not think that it doesn't contribute significantly to our property tax burden, because it does.
Right.
It's a major part.
Major part. Woo!
No.
This is wild. So I want to just point out a couple of things for our viewers. First, in 2022, 2023, the expenditures, the amount of money that this comes from the Texas Education Agency, the amount of money spent on Texas public schools was $92.4 billion. When you break that out, that is $16,792 per student in every single classroom. Okay, so we're at almost $17,000 a year, and we will get the new numbers out in a month or two. But I want to make that clear when we're talking about this, and we're talking about being able to put more money into our teachers' pockets versus steering it out of the classrooms on extravagance. I mean, these schools, if you're looking, so TASB actually did a lot of work for us. They created this architecture exhibit group. It's one of their, kind of AstroTurf groups. Like, here, come look at all these great schools. And they're lovely. You can go look at the Allen Steam Center. You can go look at all these, their $60 million football stadium. You can go look at all that stuff and go, wow, my goodness, that looks like the fanciest college campus I've ever been on. The extravagance that we're seeing while enslaving our fellow Texans and our children to debt. We are binding them to a debt. That is wrong. But let's talk about how this kind of happened. So let's go back a little further, because you say something happened. So my team started doing some research into what is going on and how did this happen? So you can go and look and you can see who actually funds these bond packages, right? Mm-hmm. Because they don't just happen. Now, we talked about the electioneering, and we know that that is going on. The school districts, we've talked about Brian Woods, who now is over at the Texas Association of School Administrators after he retired from Northside ISD by passing nearly $1 billion bond, and there was found to be some shenanigans going on. You know, teachers told that they're going to get pay cuts, all sorts of craziness. But when we look at it, we can go and see, you know, all the advertising, the marketing, much like a political campaign, right? The Prosper for the kids or Forney for the kids, or, I mean, we can just list them, and you can go look at them on Transparency USA. James, who's behind funding all of these bond packages that require advertising to the general public? For the kids, don't you know? Who's doing that?
The more exposure I've gained to this problem, mm-hmm. the more convinced I am that there is a cartel at play that has developed a rather standardized playbook that they put into place in every school district.
Yeah.
And this cartel exists for their own self-enrichment. And they have figured out what buttons to push and what levers to pull to get your trustees to sign on to massive new bond packages that they then promote, get passed, and benefit from. Mm-hmm. And so because we have relatively lax state laws in force right now, these people, as you said, have really developed a system in which resembles political campaigns, mm-hmm. and they put these things in motion every 5 to 7 years in each and every school district on our state.
Yeah.
And I think that helps explain all of the massive growth in new debt that we're seeing, and that's evidenced by the data. Mm-hmm. And of course, that has lots of consequences, not only for our tax bills, but for the integrity of our system.
Yep.
Because we have these bad actors who mm-hmm. are benefiting from the passage of new debt,
yep.
and are probably spreading the love around in mm-hmm. some really controversial ways that need to get explored and dealt with.
Yes.
And it's also, I think, contributing to the leftward tilt of some of our large urban areas, because as these things have taken root, it's very clear to me that these folks are setting up systems to protect their fiefdoms.
Yep.
And in furtherance of that, they're, donating to, let's say, city council races or county commissioner races, maybe even challenging statewide elected officials, right?
What about school board races?
School board races are, of course, our school board races are unpaid, school trustees are unpaid positions. So, it's not hard to make small donations that go far when mm-hmm. it comes to persuading those trustees, hey, now is really the best time for maybe a new administrative building or maybe a fancy new football stadium. Or what do you think about AstroTurf, right? Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. there's a lot of bad stuff that's going on at the local level that's really, I think, concerning, and hopefully coming to the attention of state lawmakers as they grapple with all of these new problems.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we've been looking into it, and we can see tracking who's funding these bonds. And I've found that that it is a cartel. It's nefarious, and they are playing off of the emotions of Texans who want to see great public schools. I want great public schools. You send your kids to a public school. I send my kid to a public charter school. We want the best schools in the country because we are raising the leaders, not just for Texas, but for the country, and by extension, the world. This is so crucial that we get this right. And yet, just 31 cents on the dollar across the state of Texas goes into our classrooms. Millions upon millions are being steered into the pockets of the profiteers, the consultants, and that cartel that you're talking about. But what I found crazy, I started looking at it and digging into, I see the same things. And again, I see them also right now, the TASA conference, Texas Association of School Administrators. I saw some people live streaming, and I caught a screenshot of who's sponsoring it. And these same actors, they're involved in, usually it's architecture, engineering, and construction. And I Googled that once, and what do you think I found? Well, I found that there are private massive billionaires, private equity firms, not even in Texas, y'all. They're in DC and New York and Chicago. And they come in and they have purchased, it's a whole move, it's called AEC. They're purchasing a lot of our construction and architecture firms that are funding these bonds that are then ending up with these massive billion-dollar contracts to build in these districts. That's crazy. How is it? Why is it that outside interests, again, private equity from out of state, it's really interesting. I dug into them and I found that several of them were currently may be, but they've made a shift. It's a whole shift from defense contracting, where there's been a light shed kind of on, $10,000 toilet seats and $20,000 bolts and crazy expenses that we're spending at for defense contractors. But there's a whole shift in the private equity market to AEC, Architecture, Engineering, and Consulting. Do you think that could have anything to do with the fact that Texas spends more money on capital outlay, building and construction and land acquisition than any other state in the union?
Absolutely. I think a lot of these outside firms take a look at places like Texas, which has been founded on a very common sense, low tax, limited government framework.
Yeah.
And they see the success of that framework and are willing to invest time, money, and resources into figuring out how to go about sucking up the riches from that successful framework. And they have determined that the bond issuance process in Texas is not only easy to game, but it's also tremendously rich if you can rig it in the right way.
AAA bond ratings, right?
AAA bond ratings, because the state has, through the Permanent School Fund, has a bond guarantee program, which means all of your 1,200 plus school districts can go into lots of debt and use the state's AAA credit rating as something of assurance to creditors and get a relatively low interest rate assigned to them, right? That has the benefit for them of being able to gobble up even more debt at a lower interest rate. So there's lots of factors at play here that I think make Texas an opportune environment for these equity firms to operate in. And what I would press the legislature for is we need some strong INS tax reforms in place to make sure that the system isn't being rigged against the taxpayer.
Yeah.
Now you might think, well, what are those reforms? I'm glad you asked. I have 35 policy prescriptions online available for lawmakers to peruse, right? These are everything from transparency to election-related reforms to as far as a local spending limit, which I think is the ultimate solution here. We've got to get a handle on spending. Otherwise, all the things we're doing on the tax side of the equation, are only going to delay the inevitable because, as it turns out, governments love to spend money. And unless you confine them to a box, a reasonably sized box, they're going to figure out a different way to soak the taxpayer. And so, but 35 individual policy prescriptions are online for lawmakers to consider. We put a lot of time and effort into developing those policy prescriptions. And in some cases, we even have model legislation for them to consider. So, I want to encourage folks to take a look at that. And that includes not only INS reforms, but things related to M&O and some other random things that we couldn't quite fit in any one category. So we've got to get a handle on this problem. Otherwise, we run the risk of becoming the next California. And I really don't want to move from Texas. I love my home state.
I love Texas and I love the people here. And I want to make sure that the veil is pulled from their eyes and recognize that there are a lot of nefarious actors. You said it best. They're part of a cartel. It's organized. I can see they're on each other's boards. Several of them. You've got architecture, the owners of architecture firms that are buying into the financial guidance firms for our public schools. You've got, I talk about this all the time. We talked about this. You've got Friends of Texas Public Schools, a C3, where the woman goes around. You've seen their billboards up and down the highway. Yeah. The woman, Leslie Milder, she goes around and says, vote for teachers. And there's 800,000 of us and all of this. Meanwhile, her husband over here is the K through 12 principal, the high-ranking official at one of the largest architecture firms in Texas, Scott Milder. Meanwhile, Scott Milder also ran against Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick for the Republican nomination. And meanwhile, they also have a side business when they're not traveling around talking to all of our public schools and hosting events with Pastors for Texas Children. They have something called Friends Consulting Group that they brag about walking you through the bond process. They do marketing. They'll run it. And I think they say they have a 90% success rate of passing bonds. We are letting the wolves into the hen house. We are sending these nefarious actors into our classrooms, into the auditoriums with teachers, into the great patriots across our state, convincing them that they must do this. When the reality is we don't need $60 million football stadiums. We don't need $80 million football stadiums. We don't need water parks or golf courses at our public schools. We need teachers that are paid what they deserve. Excellent teachers need to be getting pay raises instead of steering it out of the classroom to these cartel members. And we need to get back to the basics, making sure our children learn to read, to write, to understand history, civics, and mathematics so they are prepared to launch. And that really is what all of this is the parent empowerment movement. It's the teacher empowerment movement. It is the taxpayer empowerment movement. We are going to lift the lid and expose the nefarious entities that are driving up our property taxes, driving down the quality of education our kids are getting, and enslaving us to a debt that is unsustainable.
Man, I could not have said that better. I do want to add one little bit at the end because you've nailed it. You have lots of consulting groups and cartel members who are benefiting from the passage of these bonds. I don't want to leave this conversation without hitting at the chief bond salesman in every district, which is the superintendent, right? Superintendents very often come into a school setting with the chief aim of shepherding a massive bond through whatever district they're in, right?
Yep.
And I think it's one of the reasons why our school superintendents are so highly paid.
$600,000.
Yes.
And we've got over 120 of them making more than the top 5%. They're in the top 5% of Texans.
Right.
That's absurd.
8 of the top 10 highest paid superintendents in Texas are paid more than the president of the United States.
It's nuts.
Right. And these people are very well paid because they're very good at selling the public on bonds.
Yep.
And it drives me crazy because the chief role of a superintendent ought to be ensuring that your students are learning to read, write, and do math, not justifying to the public why another, $1 billion bond is needed.
That's right.
But of course, it's not just that superintendents are well paid on the salary side. They are. Texas has superintendents who are paid well in excess of the median superintendent salary nationwide.
Yep.
But I think it's because they've been catching a lot of heat on the salary issue. They've now started to shift a lot of the compensation to the benefit side, right? So anybody who's interested in learning more, I encourage you to go look at your superintendent's contract because you'll probably find things like a technology allowance, a car allowance, a defined benefit program, right? Housing. I even have
look at that.
Lots of information on these guys receiving housing.
It's almost a $2 million house.
This is Highland Park ISD bought a $2 million house for their superintendent to live in. These are the types of things that school districts are doing right now instead of putting that money in the classroom.
Meanwhile, and this is in Austin ISD, I'm looking at it, and they're doing it at all these major ISDs. Oh, we can't pay our teachers more, and they can't afford housing. You can pay your teachers more. Full stop. 31 cents on the dollar goes into the classroom. You absolutely can pay your teachers more. Stop paying these lobbyists, consultants, and these architecture, engineering, consulting, contracting firms and driving up the cost. Send the money. Because what they're doing at all these major is they've decided we're going to build teacher housing. Teachers don't want to live in government housing. Are you kidding me? Not only are they not, building their lives and growing equity, but guess who wants to build those housing? Private equity owned developers. It's all right there. It's all online. You can track who's pushing it. It is criminal. We are not treating our teachers right. We are not treating our parents right. We are not treating our taxpayers right. And I'm glad you brought that up because this has got to stop. This cartel has got to be shut down. We have got to stop allowing the money to be steered out of the classrooms by these bad actors. It has to end, not only for the parents of Texas, but all of the patriots who are sitting there looking at their property tax bill going, I can't afford to go on a modest vacation. Meanwhile, we're sending trustees to the JW Marriott or Kalahari every couple months. I mean, this is wild and I've had enough. And I'm so grateful to you and your team for exposing this. The next time we talk, you and I are going to talk about how these superintendents and these directors and administrators go into it, get their sweet benefits package upwards of $300,000 a year. And then they end up going to work for these exact architecture and construction firms that are a part of selling back to our districts AstroTurf, building projects, all that. That's what's happening. That's what's happening, Texans. That's why the parent empowerment movement is fighting to empower every single parent in the state of Texas with education savings accounts. James, look in that camera. Talk to the legislators and talk to Texans. Tell them why they not only need to join us on the parent empowerment movement, why they need to join us here at Texas Public Policy Foundation. Follow you on Twitter. You're one of the most fun people ever to follow. Tell them why we have got to not only provide property tax relief, property tax reform, and crush this cartel that is crushing the taxpayers in Texas.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the opportunity. Policymakers, one of the best things that you guys did during the 2023 legislative session was provide meaningful and at the time it was thought to be long-lasting tax relief. But as it turns out, that tax relief didn't last very long at all because we have a lot of opportunistic local governments who really eroded the value of those savings to the average person into nothing. And so my plea to you today is to learn from that experience, learn from the fact that you guys can do something really good only for local governments to upend it entirely in a relatively short period, and use that to inform your decision-making this session. We need strong tax reforms to complement any tax relief that you guys do. Otherwise, we're going to be back at the very same place we are right now, but in 2 years' time.
James, thank you for all of your great research and sharing with the public what's going on, why their property taxes keep going up, why the students inside their school buildings keep getting lesser quality education, and why Texans are divided. We must come together. We must fight back. I'm so grateful to all the work that you and your team are doing. Thank you all for joining us today on Parent Empowerment with Mandy Drogin. And now you have the power.